sound like they got my mic on. Jonathan saw me up here getting stuff ready, and he flicked the lights just a little bit early. I'm trying to give you guys to a quarter after. I know we're still planning on building that bathroom back there. I was talking to John just a second ago, and he said they're getting pretty close to being able to do that. So we'll have that. That'll help our intermediate break. We like to give you time to have a break in between so that you have time to talk and we can enjoy our visitors and converse with each other. So I'm not trying to press you too much. I want to get started about a quarter after, so we're there. So we'll go ahead and get started with class this morning. If you bow with me, we'll get started with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're thankful for your scriptures, the wisdom in them, all the things that we can learn and enjoy from studying together as like-minded Christians. We're so thankful, Father, for the blessing that we're able to have these, and for your Son, Jesus Christ, that gives us the opportunity for heaven. Thank you for all that you give us. Pray that you continue to be patient with us. Please help me to present this lesson and the things that I have prepared in a way that it'll be beneficial to those that are here. Through Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. All right, I hadn't taught in a day or two, so I'm glad. I'm excited to get to talk, and we're going to continue our efforts that Don and I had decided we were going to start on some character studies, so we're going to do that this morning. I'm going to continue with a character study, but before I get into that, I ask a couple of questions. If I told you that Gina and I was going to go to lunch this afternoon at Demo's restaurant, who would know where I was talking about? Lots of us. We know it's Demo's. Do you know that's not really the name of that restaurant? Would that surprise you to learn that? I see a head nodding. Some folks know. See, I saw a commercial come on a couple of years ago, and it was one of the family members advertising that restaurant, and it was post-COVID, and they were trying to get people to come back, and they said Demas's restaurant, and that's what they called it. And I thought, well, that's weird, and they're an Italian family, I guess, and that's the pronunciation that they have for that restaurant. So you can go and Google that, and you can find videos where they're talking about with the employees there their favorite foods of that restaurant, and sure enough, that's how they say it, Demas's. And the last name of the guy that started it, which is the patriarch of the family, his last name is Demas. So that's simple. It's a pronunciation thing. And we see that quite a bit whenever we get into talking about names of different people in the Bible. You know, we're going to have some of that this morning with the guy that we're going to talk about. You can Google how to pronounce his name. You can, funny enough, there's probably 2 pages. If you Google this guy's name, there's probably 2 pages that you can see of people arguing about they've got the right way to pronounce this guy's name and how to enunciate it. And they contort their face and they wrinkle their eyebrows, and it's comical really to see how some of the folks are trying to pronounce this guy's name. And Don and I were talking about it, and we've got ideas of how to pronounce it. So this is who we're going to study about this morning, Tychicus, or Tychicus, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And you may hear me pronounce it either way. I've said this so much, and Don and I were talking about it. I said, I'm going to go for the easy way that'll roll off the tongue good, because I'm probably going to say this 15 times as we go through it. And the truth is even if we pronounce it exactly like we think it needs to be pronounced, I'm not from this region. I wasn't from this time. It's probably not going to enunciate exactly right. And if you want to know what I'm talking about, have an Hispanic friend that his native language is Spanish and have him tell you how to pronounce a word, and you'll learn how to say it to where Hispanic folks know what you're talking about. It still won't sound Spanish. Not in our American tongue, and especially not me with my Buck Mountain slang. Very country. So Tychicus or Tychicus, however you want to pronounce it, that's probably the 2 easiest ways that I'm going to go with this morning to be able to pronounce it. But by the time we get to the end of this study, I hope that you realize or you'll understand more of why I picked him for our character study today. Now, like I talked about before, a character study is useful to learn information, but it's only really useful for you if we study in our Bible class in a way that's going to add substance to your life. What's a practical application? There will always be practical application with these character studies, and that's what I hope to do here with us today. Now, you see me a lot of times teach from over here, so I can look at the PowerPoint and I can see it pretty good from the back with my contacts in today. Don't have a lot of slides, but I don't really need a lot with this study. We've got a few different places that we're going to look at to learn about Tychicus or Tychicus, however you want to say it, and see if I don't pick one or the other, I'll get hung between the 2. So we'll say Tychicus this morning. To be able to study about Tychicus, to be able to really learn what's happening in Tychicus' life and learn about him, we've got to know what's happening in the area that Tychicus is living during his time. So the first section of scriptures that we're going to look at this morning is Acts chapter 11, verses 27 through 30. Now, those of you that have studied this section of verses before, right away you're going to understand that before you even turn over there, you're going to think, oh, that's the section of verses where they're talking about the great famine that's coming. And they're going to talk about, that this famine that's about to be upon them, and it's going to be told through prophecy, and you would be correct. So We're going to start there for a reason, and this is going to be the intro to us. It's not going to talk about Tychicus in these versions. In these verses, it's not going to talk about Tychicus in the next verses that we're going to talk about. But it's going to lead us up to learning about him, because he's going to be involved in this process. And to understand him and his life and what he was doing better, we've got to understand what was happening in his world at that time. Suffering's coming in the form of a famine here is what they're going to see. And we'll start out in Acts chapter 11. We'll read verses 27 through 30. It said, "In these days prophets came from Jerusalem to Antioch. Then one of them, named Agabus, stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout all the world." Well, a famine is where they're going to be short on food. We understand that. It doesn't really say how that is going to happen, but we can understand after about a month, and some of you may have had rain at your house. I've not had it at my house, and I've not had it at the farm. That's been any measurable amount. There's not been rain. And those of you that have yards to mow, you know your yards have turned a little bit. It's getting brown. You're not having to mow as much. But those of us that have a farm means something completely different. The grasses in the farm have changed. They've turned. And if those of you that had a farm and have been around cows, you have to know a little bit about how to speak moo cow. When you go up to the cows and they come around the tractor and they got this certain way they moo at you, they're letting you know they ain't happy. Well, they've not been happy about 2 weeks now. The farm grass has went different. It's changed. And what winds up happening, you get into this famine, and I'm telling you this for a reason. You get into this famine, or not famine, a drought's what I meant to say. You get into this drought, and there's no rain, and the grass is going to change. And what winds up happening is the sugars in that grass. Sugars is energy for cattle. The sugars in that grass is going to go back to the root, and it's going to try to keep alive, right? That grass is trying to survive. It doesn't really care if the cow has something to eat. The grass is just trying to live. So the grass pulls the sugars back to the root to live, and then the cows eat that. They don't get those sugars. They don't get the taste they like, and they don't get the energy they need from it. So a lot of us that have farms have already started feeding hay. This is early to be feeding hay. So I was leading up to this, and I had a lot of hay this summer. I had a better hay summer than I've had in a long time, and I was thinking about this. God's blessed me with this, and I didn't know why. Well, I didn't have an Agabus to tell me there's a drought coming, and they did. So he's telling us there's not a lot of rain in this region. You can see this picture behind it. This is a region from Judea. This is a picture from that Judean region. It's a desert region. One seasonal rain that they missed to some significance, and it's going to change. Just like in 3 or 4 weeks' time, our pastures have changed. We're setting out hay. We're already having to feed grain. It's a change for people that farm. And water is a problem. People are having to take their cattle to sell because they don't have ponds that are holding water. Some ponds are dry. Mine's not, but the water's not great. I'm putting them on city water. I've got a tank I fill. All that doesn't help you spiritually, but it helps you to understand what these folks are having to try to go through, or what they're having to try to learn or change or do, because they've got this drought coming. And Agabus tells them, he says, there's this famine coming. He stood up and he showed by the Spirit, through the Spirit, that there was going to be a great famine throughout the world, and that meant all the known world to them, which also happened in the days of Claudius Caesar. And then the disciples, each according to his ability, determined to send relief to the brethren dwelling in Judea. This they also did, and sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. In this part of the world, a seasonal rain is a big, big deal. They depend on that. They depend on it not only for grain and things to feed their cattle, their animals, their sheep, their oxen. They depend on that to eat themselves. So if they know this ahead of time, then they can store up. And they can put aside extra grain. They can put aside money. This money that they're going to take up and they're going to send to them is going to be so that they can buy grain off of some of the neighbors that don't have an Agabus to tell them, hey, there's a drought coming, there's a famine coming. So they're going to buy up grain and they're going to prepare, and it's going to help them be able to sustain this. This could be one famine, or it could be one long famine, or it could be 2 famines that we're going to study about here leading up to this. And it doesn't really matter if you believe as we go through this that it's one long famine or if it's 2 shorter ones. It's still kind of the same end result for our story. And you're going to see Paul get involved in preparing for this famine as we go forward and continue to study about this. Interesting things that we're going to learn, I hope, in this study that maybe you don't really get if you don't study a little deeper like we're going to today, like Tychicus in general. Never really paid much attention to him, but to know as many times as he's mentioned and what he's involved in, I hope that you find that interesting too. Next verses we're going to go to is 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. Now what's this dealing with? You guys know this off the top of your head. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4. Collection, yeah, it's taking up the collections for the saints. We usually read this a lot of times from up front when we're about to take up collection of the church, and we reference this a lot of times. It talks about it on the first day of the week. We've read this a lot, but there's a little bit more to it than what we usually read here. So we'll read through it, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Starting in verse 1 of 1 Corinthians 16, it says, "Now concerning the collection of the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay by something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. And when I come, whoever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. And if it is fitting that I may go also, they will go with me." Now we've read this first part of that so much, I almost read it like I usually say it, take up collections so that there be no collections when they come. Well, that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to be prepared, and they were trying to take up that collection. And we notice that they do it on the first day of the week. These are things that we've studied about and talked about a lot. Nothing really new to learn there, an argument about that. But something that you need to understand about this collection that we don't often talk about, it's going to be a fairly large collection to be picked up. So Paul's telling them, he says, get this collection taken together so that you don't have to do it when I get there. I want it to be prepared because when I come, I want to pick this collection up. And I'm betting he didn't only say this to the Corinthian congregation. He mentions Galatia here too. And I'm betting not only that, but all the area congregations were instructed by Paul more than likely to do the same. They were going to take up collection to help their brethren in Judea that they knew was going to be having this famine that was probably going to be instigated by a drought. What kind of money did they have back then during this time? Have the kind of money Jonathan was showing on the screen this morning? Silver. That's mostly what it was. How'd they carry it? Bags. Money belts. Did they throw it over their shoulder or carry it in their hand usually? Did they? Usually tried to hide that in a way that you couldn't really see that they were carrying that. So put this in perspective. Paul's sending out word through these letters to these area congregations, and he's saying, hey, you need to take up this money. So they start saving this money, and they're putting it in a collection as silver coins during this time. It's going to be a lot. It's going to be heavy. They're going to have to carry it through money belts or bags or ways that they can sling it around them, and they can kind of hide it or conceal it as they're carrying it. And they're going to have to carry it long distances because they're going to round through all the region to collect this collection to get it in a way that they can take it to the brethren there in Judea, whether it's under their garments or however they choose to try to do that so they can carry this. And it's not going to be announced widespread so people don't know they're going to be traveling on these roads carrying these monies. But it's different than carrying a wad of bills. There won't be any checks written. So it's going to be silver and they'll have to carry it. There'll be multiple men that will be appointed to do this. And you see here where he says, here in the last part of these verses, says, "Then whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear this gift to Jerusalem." Do you know our checks here at the congregation have 2 signature lines on them? Some of you know that because you've been reimbursed by things and you've probably paid attention to see that. Why would we have 2 signature lines on our checks? Jonathan can't answer this one. Yeah, make sure it's approved. That protects Don and I from the possibility of somebody saying, well, you know, there's been a check written that's over a certain amount. Now, these signature lines only kick in at a certain amount. That protects Don and I. It protects the secretaries. It protects against the possibility of thought of theft if somebody wanted to try to do that, which I don't expect that here. So it's an above-board kind of way to do things. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to use that as a way that would be expected to be under a normal business circumstance that we would do here. So that way, if you got 2 signatures on there, then at least those 2 people know about what's happening. It's more than likely not going to be something that shouldn't be happening if 2 people are signing this and not just one. There's a reason that we have more than one person counting the contribution whenever they go back to count contribution. When that collection is taken up and it's counted, we do that. It's a way to do things above board so that it can't be looked at negatively by anyone, really. It keeps it from being in a situation where something could be questioned, and it's a safeguard and it protects. Second part of this passage that you might not have really noticed or paid attention to when we talk about the first part, that you've paid a lot of attention to, is when he says, "And when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. But if it is fitting that I go also, they will go with me." Paul is saying here, you guys need to pick it out. You need to look. You need to pick out people that are fitting. You pick out people that are honorable, that are trustworthy, Because this is going to be a lot of money, and it's going to be a hard trip. It needs to be somebody that's fit, that's able to do it. You can't have folks with health issues or difficulties or have a hard time walking because they've got to walk to carry this money. He's saying, pick these people out. And when Paul is saying here, he said, if it be fitting that I go also, they will go with me. He's saying, I might not go. If it's fitting, if it works out, then I'm going to go. I don't have to handle the money. I don't have to be the one that takes the money, that carries the money. That doesn't have to be me. You need to pick out men that are worthy to be able to carry out this task. 2 Corinthians 8, 16 through 21 is where we'll go to next. Now, this is sometime later. It doesn't really tell us how long later this is. You know, we know that the first letter was written to the Corinthians, and then they had questions, and then the second letter was written. And so there's some time has passed, and that's why there's some of the discussion about this famine and this money that's being taken up. Is it one long famine? Is it one that lasted a long time? Or is it two different ones? It's not really important to the story, but this is sometime later. And this goes along with the discussion of protecting those funds. Paul is going to be saying here that he's going to collect this money and we're going to take these precautions, and he's going to talk about why. So let's read 16 through 21. But thanks be to God who puts the same earnest care for you into the heart of Titus, for he not only accepted the exhortation, but being more diligent, he went to you of his own accord. So he's saying about Titus, this is a good recommendation here for Titus. He said not only did he accept this exhortation, not only did he rise up to the job that he knew was before him, but he actually even went and he volunteered for this. He was more diligent. He said, being more diligent, he went to you of his own accord. We didn't have to prod him or talk him into it. He went. And we have sent with him the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches, and not only that, but who also was chosen by the churches to travel with us with this gift. Doesn't tell us here who this brother is. That's a pretty strong recommendation of this brother, but it doesn't say who this is. It said that he was known throughout all the churches, that had praise throughout all the churches. A very good thing spoken about somebody that we're not really told who that is. And he's going to travel with us with this gift, which is administered by us to the glory of the Lord himself, and to show your ready mind, avoiding this, that anyone should blame us in this lavish gift, which is administered by us, providing honorable things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. So there is the thought, too, that they might not be into this famine yet. This might be pre-famine. It could be before the famine really got started. So, this could be the planning still before it leads up to the famine. It doesn't really tell us, but it doesn't change the point of our story and what we're talking about. And Paul's saying we're going to collect this money and we're going to take these precautions. And it's like I was talking about earlier with the two signature lines. He talks about this too, about where he says that anyone should not blame us in this lavish gift. Had to be a lot of money. It's why that we do the protections and the cautions that we do here along the same lines. Should there be any question about fraudulent activity in them carrying this money, then it'll be easily answered, because there's going to be a group of men that's going to do that. They're going to oversee it, and they're going to watch, and they're picking out men of top reputation that would be able to do this. So he talks about a lavish gift, and then think about how this would look. Now let's think about if it is a situation where the famine hadn't started yet. It's a little bit of a Noah's Ark kind of thing if you think about it. They're taking up money and they're sending this money and they're bringing it to the brethren at Judea. And some of the folks in the world are going to find out about this, and they're going to know about this, and they're going to think, what's some Christians doing over there? The way they were called a lot of times with this. And this particular sect, what are they doing? They're taking up money and they're sending it up there to Judea, and we're going to watch them. We're going to see what they're going to do. And then surprise, here comes this famine. All of a sudden they're buying up grain. They've got the money to do that. They're buying up grain. They're feeding their animals. They're still able to cook their bread and do their things. They're worshiping like they should. They're making their sacrifices because their animals are healthy. They're not in the same shape that those around them would be. Something I never thought about reading these verses. You think about that and you think, wow, what a testament that would be to Christians following God and going by God's instruction. If they were asked the question, what do you think they would say? Somebody comes up and says, why y'all took the money up? How do you have the money? How do you have the grain? You bought this stuff up ahead of time. How did you know that? Well, one of our prophets told us from God. My God did this. My God told me this. Kind of like us being able to read these things that we read today, to know how to worship and live and do the things that we do. We head off a lot of problems because we're following God's wisdom. We know that in the medical community, and we won't get off into all that. But we see that following God's wisdom makes our life better and easier in a lot of ways. I think that would have shown up here whenever they started buying up grain and storing grain. People would be thinking, isn't the grain you're raising going to be enough grain? But they were getting ready for this famine that was coming. Ingenious, really. And it would have been a testament to their faith to those around them. Acts chapter 20. Now we're going to introduce Tychicus, or Tychicus. It's the first time that we're going to see him mentioned in the Scriptures if you're taking this in order. Acts chapter 20, verses 1 through 6. Starting in verse 1 there in Acts chapter 20, it says, After the uproar had ceased, Paul called the disciples to himself, embraced them, and departed to go to Macedonia. And then when he had gone over that region and encouraged them with many words, he came to Greece and stayed there 3 months. And when the Jews plotted against him, as he was about to sail to Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. And Sopater of Berea accompanied him. To Asia, also Aristarchus and Secundus of the Thessalonians, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy and Tychicus of Trophimus, and Trophimus of Asia. So he says here that Timothy, Tychicus, and Trophimus was of Asia. These men going ahead waited for us at Troas, but he sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where they stayed 7 days. This is a short list of men that's going to be traveling with Paul, and I'd say it's probably not all the men that's going to wind up carrying this money, but Tychicus was part of these men that was going to be carrying this money. And what Paul says here is we have men from Berea, from Derbe, Thessalonica, and Asia, but this is not the Asia that we think about. These aren't Asian folks. They were Asian folks, I guess, back then, but not Orient of Asian folks like what we would think. This is not Asia. This is Asia Minor. It's modern day Turkey is where this would be. So this is where they'd be from. So when it says Asia, he's talking about Asia Minor, not the Asia that we might think of. This is the first time that Tychicus is mentioned, and we learn that he's from Asia or Asia Minor. It would be impressive to be selected as part of this short list of men to handle this task. We start out with a good feeling about these men because they know that they've been selected from men from a very broad area. You see all these different regions that these men were selected from, and here they are. That's a pretty short list of folks that are mentioned that are from these areas, because there was a lot of people who lived in these areas at that time. The church would understand that these men have been selected and why they've been selected, and the trust that they would have in them, and they were handpicked. And Tychicus is one of those men that are handpicked, and we find out that Paul is indeed going to go on this journey and that he's going to be able to travel with him. So we're not going to talk about the money anymore here for a few minutes, and we're going to turn our attention a little bit different direction, because we're about to start to talk about the Ephesians and the Colossians as how it relates to Tychicus, and we find that Tychicus will be mentioned here. So there's some things that we're going to learn about Tychicus that will help us learn about him on a deeper level that we might not know if we didn't study it from this perspective. Things from his background for us that we wouldn't know unless we went to a deeper study on someone like Tychicus. It's what I like about studying a character study. I almost want to tell it like we could stand and watch Tychicus from a distance, and that we would be able to see his life play out before us. And you can do that more with some folks that we know more about. It's a little bit harder with Tychicus because he hasn't been talked about a whole lot. But it impresses upon us that Tychicus obviously is a real person. He had a life, and we don't know anything about him. We don't know if he was married, if he had children. We don't know about that, but we know from how he is described here and what we're about to read that he was very well thought of in the community and in the churches, and it's definitely upper level is the way he's doing his life. And we know that he put his life on hold, whatever that was, whatever job he worked or whatever he done. This isn't an easy trip, and we're going to talk about that. But we know that now about Tychicus. We think about that in relation to us and how we put our lives on hold and things that we change and we do differently because we want to align ourselves with God's plan and with God's Word. And we want to help the church and do the things that we need to do. So that's Tychicus. That's what he's doing. He says here in verse 21, and we're going to read 21 and 22 of Ephesians chapter 6. But that you also may know, and this is Paul sent this letter to Ephesians, he said, but that you also may know my affairs and how I'm doing. Tychicus, my beloved brother, and faithful minister in the Lord, will make all things known to you, whom I have sent to you for this very purpose, that you may know our affairs, and that he may comfort your hearts. Pretty big deal what Paul has just said here about Tychicus. He says that you may know my affairs and how I'm doing. So the reason Paul is saying that is when Paul writes this letter, and where Paul is at right now, while he's penning the words of this letter, and when he's sending Tychicus to the Ephesian brethren, Paul is on house arrest there in Rome, and he's waiting to learn his fate from Caesar. He's waiting to meet with Caesar because Caesar's not there. He's not in town right now, and he's waiting for his date to be able to meet with Caesar. And he sends this because Paul can't go himself. So he sends this letter to the Ephesians, and he says, I'm sending Tychicus that he knows my affairs. He's saying Tychicus knows me. He knows me well. He's with me daily. He understands what's happening to me. He knows what's happening here. What you'll get from him is the truth. It'll be accurate, and you'll understand it. He had to communicate with the churches, and he had to have a way to do it. And this is how he done it. He sent trusted men to go communicate with the churches. And one of the things, as we study through this, that makes this even more impressive is that he's coming from Rome, because Paul is in Rome, and he's going over here to the Ephesian brethren, and we'll see that he'll go to the Colossian brethren. That's about 1,000 miles, depending on what region that you're going to wind up being in, what region that you're going to be in, Ephesus or Colossae, to Rome, and where Paul's at in Rome. About 1,000 miles. Not an easy trip. Didn't have email, didn't have a cell phone, didn't have internet, didn't even have the postal service. Postal service is not as good as it used to be. Hope you don't work for the postal service. If you do, you might agree with me. Stuff's in the wrong mailboxes and everything all the time. I don't know that I would send a letter that I thought had to get there. But they don't even have that. That would have been a better option than what they had back then. So they had to pick somebody like Tychicus to send. Huge deal. What if the letter got lost in the process? We've got that letter here in front of us in our lap today. You're holding it in your hand. What if it had gotten lost? Big deal, Monty.
To add emphasis upon what you're saying about Tychicus going, in Acts 20 and 22, he says, I go in spirit, Paul. He goes in spirit with them to deliver this to Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like Monty's saying, he's carrying, whenever Tychicus carries this letter, he's going in spirit with them. He's going to send somebody he trusts because it's of utmost importance that the job is done properly. So he picks out a Tychicus and he sends him. The only option he had is to write the letters. And the length of time that it would take from the time the letter is written till they traveled this 1,000 or so miles on foot, probably be very little opportunity to ride, whether it might be on burro or chariot. Most of the time they walked and went where they went. So it was going to take a while. And we didn't want to have these letters to be lost any more than what Paul does, because we have the benefit of being able to have them here. Out of everyone that Paul picked, he picked Tychicus to deliver this. In verse 21, look at the description that he says. And this is where we're going to really get into who Tychicus is. In verse 21, he calls him a beloved brother, a faithful minister, who will make all things known to you. You know, that's what I was saying earlier. He says, Tychicus knows me well. He knows the work well. He knows what's happening here. He knows the situation I'm in, why I'm in prison, why I'm waiting on Caesar. Tychicus knows all this. If there's something to know about me, if there's something to know about the work, if there's something to know about the Lord's church in this area, Tychicus is going to be able to tell you. It's not just information that he's bringing, though. Look in verse 22. He says, whom I have sent to you for this very purpose, comma, that you may know our affairs, comma, and that he may comfort your hearts. That's probably even a bigger deal to me, the way I read this, than if you think about somebody that just knows information. That he may comfort your hearts. How is Tychicus going to comfort their hearts? Yeah. It's kind of a multi-level answer, really. I know you're probably sitting there thinking, what's he looking for? I don't want to answer something different. And then he says, no, it's really this. It's a multi-level answer, really.
Well, he's got to be a trustworthy person as well, and somebody that's just, hey, he can beat off people trying to rob him. So he's got to be a communicator. He's got to be able to interact with people.
Yeah.
People have to be able to trust what he
The reason it's a multi-level answer, you know, it said that he's faithful. Tychicus is faithful, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but Tychicus is going to know things that they couldn't know any other way. He's going to come in the spirit of Paul, like Monty said. He's going to be able to explain things like you guys are saying. It's going to come from a place of not only knowledge, but spiritual, faithful knowledge. He's going to tell them things about the church. Back in this time frame, we didn't have the written word, so the only thing that was getting spread around is some of these letters that would be put out with the instruction that they had and what they were supposed to follow. So they were going to get some of that, but they would not know some of the things that had been exposed to these Christians any other way, other through prophecy or through ways that God was communicating with them miraculously during this time. So Tychicus would be able to convey some of those things, and they know what they're going to get from him with being a faithful minister and this close to Paul, that it's going to be accurate information. It's going to help them spiritually. It's not just so they can know what the weather's like. It's so much more than that, information-wise. Carrying along the same theme, we're going to look at Colossians 4, 7, and 8. And the pictures that I picked out for these backgrounds on these are actually supposed to be from the cities that we're talking about. And these are some ruins that are left of these statues here in Colossae. Supposed to be, anyway. Colossians chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. And what we're going to read here is it's going to be very, very similar. And I'm going to have to pick up the pace just a little. Colossians 4, verses 7 and 8, he says, Tychicus, a beloved brother, almost identical to the other letter that we saw to Ephesus, faithful minister, fellow servant in the Lord, will tell you all the news about me, and I'm sending him to you for this very purpose, that he may know your circumstances and comfort your hearts. So it's very much the same, but we're going to pick up something here. I don't think I've ever noticed this until I got to study this on a deeper level. We kind of stop right there, and we don't really keep going, but the latter parts of these verses are going to tell us something that maybe we didn't notice. He goes on here. He's going to comfort your hearts. And then in verse 9, he says this, with Onesimus, a faithful and beloved brother also. I mean, he says the same thing, a faithful and beloved brother who is one of you. What's that mean, who is one of you? Well, it means that Onesimus is one of the Colossians. Onesimus is from Colossae. But who is Onesimus? Do you recognize that name at all? Book of Philemon. I'd never made that connection before. So whenever I read through this and I studied this and I kept going on that, I thought, wow, what about that? Onesimus, could that be the same guy? And then I get to reading, and then you figure out as we go forward here, we're going to see that. Onesimus was the runaway slave of Philemon. Well, what happens to runaway slaves nowadays? Well, not nowadays. What happens to runaway slaves back then? Whenever the slaves would run off and shirk their responsibility, what would happen to a runaway slave? Be thrown in jail, right? Punished. So you've got a guy here that's Onesimus, and we're going to go over and look at Philemon. That'll be the next place we go. He's a runaway slave. He's living as an illegal in another city. But as we start to read about this, and we're going to read through Philemon here in just a minute. And when we go through and we look at all this, we're going to learn a few things. Let's jump over and look at Philemon. And I'm going to tell you some of these things to look for as we go through and look at this. We're going to find out that Paul was the one that actually taught and converted Onesimus here. A runaway slave living as an illegal in another city is someone who would be looked at as dishonest and that can't be trusted. We're going to find out that Onesimus spent time with Paul, that he was taught by Paul, he was ministering to Paul, he was taking care of Paul while he was there in his bondage, while he was on house arrest. But what's always going to wind up happening in a situation like this, when you've got a runaway slave and then they're converted, or if you've got a person that's doing something and they're in an illegal situation, or they're in a situation they shouldn't be in, what's going to wind up happening is when they're converted and they're taught the gospel, and you know the gospel will do this. When you're taught the gospel, they're going to correct those things, and then at some point the person that teaches them, like Paul obviously did here, he's going to say, you know, Onesimus, you got to go back. You've got to fix this. You're illegal. You're doing something dishonest. You're not going to be trustworthy. Can you imagine the conversation that would happen with the fellow Christians there in Rome? And they ask Onesimus, well, where are you from? And he, Colossae. I come from Colossae. What'd you do there? Where'd you work? Where'd you live? What can you tell them? He was a slave. Can you imagine the dance he would have to do, of the things that he would have to say, and how sticky that would get to be able to convey that information without a lie being in there somewhere, and he can't lie? The only way to make this right is to really fix it. So I'm sure at some point Paul says, you've got to go back. That would be tough. But what Onesimus didn't know, and what he's going to find out, and what you're going to see here, is Paul also knew Philemon. Paul converted Philemon. Paul and Philemon are very close, and Paul is going to write a letter to Philemon on Onesimus' behalf. Can you imagine if you were Onesimus? And Paul says, it's okay. You got to go back, but I'm going to write this letter for you, and I'm going to make it okay because I'm going to appeal to my friend. I converted him too. He'll understand. So Paul writes this letter, Philemon. So let's read through it. And Paul, a prisoner of Jesus Christ, or Christ Jesus, and Timothy, our brother, he mentions Timothy too, to Philemon, our brother, our beloved friend and fellow laborer, to beloved Athea, Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church in your home. We find out that the church there is in Philemon's home, who is, everyone popularly thinks that this church in Philemon's home was in Colossae. And you're going to find out that that's where Onesimus was from. So not only he's going back there, he's going back home, but he's going back to face the music, as we used to say. So here's what Paul says. He kind of butters the bread a little bit here. He smooths things up, however you want to say that. Verse 4, he says, I thank my God, making mention of you always. Paul talking about Philemon, he said, making mention of you always in my prayers, hearing of your love and your faith, which you have toward the Lord Jesus and toward all the saints, that sharing of your faith may become effective by the acknowledgement of every good thing which is in you in Christ Jesus. For we have great joy and consolation in your love, because of the hearts of the saints have been refreshed by you, brother. That's very complimentary from Paul. He's pointing out things that Philemon would probably open this letter and he'd read that and he'd say, wow, Paul is like, this is like, people know what we're doing here and the effort that we're making, and this is really great that I'm having this kind of impact on the church. Philemon would think very positive things, and then he keeps reading, and then he sees where Paul says this, therefore, though I might be very bold in Christ to command you what is fitting, yet for love's sake I rather appeal to you, being such a one as Paul, the aged, and now also a prisoner of Jesus Christ, I appeal to you for my son Onesimus. I bet Philemon didn't expect to hear the word Onesimus mentioned in a letter coming from Paul. I bet he's sitting there thinking, well, I don't even know where Onesimus went. Well, Onesimus went all the way to Rome, because Onesimus went 1,000 miles away, because he was never planning on coming back. He never imagined himself ever being back there in front of Philemon, in front of him, his person that he's supposed to be serving. He went 1,000 miles away to have this not happen, yet to remain a faithful Christian, he has to go fix this. And here is Philemon reading about this, that this is why Onesimus is here standing in front of me, because it would be delivered by Onesimus, the letter would. And Paul says here in 11, he says, well, let's back up to 10. I appeal for you, for my son Onesimus, whom I have begotten while in my chains, who once was unprofitable to you, but now is profitable to you and to me. So Paul is saying, up here in verse 8, he's saying, I could tell you had to do this. I could command you that you had to do this in Christ. I could say you had to do it, but yet for love's sake, because I know the kind of love that you have, I'd rather appeal to you. I'm going to appeal to you. I'm Paul, I'm older, I'm in prison, I'm in chains. And this guy Onesimus, he's been here with me, and I've begotten him. I converted him, I taught him. He's like my son in the gospel, because I converted him while I was here in my chains. And he's not only profitable to you, but he's profitable to me. He wasn't profitable to you before he ran off. He said, I'm sending him back in verse 12. You therefore receive him, that is of my own heart. Onesimus is like my own heart, whom I wished I could keep Onesimus here with me, that on your behalf he might minister to me in my chains for the gospel, but without your consent. I wanted to do nothing. I didn't want to do this without your consent. You had to know it. You had to give your blessing, because he ran away. He was your slave. That your good deed might not be by compulsion, as it were voluntary. He backs back up to what he said before. I'm doing this. I want to give you a chance to do this out of love, to do the right thing, not by compulsion. I'm not making you do it. I want you to do it because you want to do it. I want it to be voluntary. And then he says in verse 15, perhaps he departed for a while for this purpose. Maybe this is why all this worked out. He was a slave. He ran off. He came all the way to Rome. He wound up with me. I taught him the gospel. Now he's a Christian. Might not have happened at your house. Maybe that's the purpose this whole thing happened. Verse 16, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. And then he goes on and says some more stuff here. He says, if then you count me as a partner, receive him as you would me. Receive him just like you would me. If he's wronged you with anything, if he's stolen anything, if he owes you anything, if he's in debt to you in any way, I, Paul, am writing this in my own hand. I will repay, not to mention to you that you owe me even of your own self besides. See, he converted him. So remember, Colossians 4 and 9, Paul refers to Onesimus as one of you, talking about he's from Colossae. That's his hometown. Titus 3 and 12, we got 5 minutes left, so I got to hustle. Colossians 3 and 12, this is the last mention that we'll see of Tychicus. The last time we see him mentioned. Verse 12 says, and when I send Artemas to you, or Tychicus, and this is writing to Titus, be diligent and come to me at Nicopolis, for I decided to spend the winter there. I'm going to skip over some of this part because the last part is what I want to get to before we close it out. The good part about Tychicus being mentioned here is Paul is going to send him to take Titus's place, where Titus is doing an amazing work, converting and changing and doing a lot of things in that area. And Paul says Tychicus or Artemas, these two men could come do that work while you come to me. That would be an amazing thing for somebody to be able to say about you, that you could go take on that work. Romans chapter 12 is where I'm trying to get to, and here's the practical application, and I've got about 3 or 4 minutes. Romans chapter 12, starting in verse 9, and we're supposed to read through verse 21. And what I want you to get out of this as we read through it, I want you to get out of this is doctrinally heavy here. If you want to talk about practical application, you want to talk about how to live like Tychicus did, if you want to talk about having the attitude like Tychicus did, like, if you're going to go, I'm the one that wants to go, I'm going to do this. If you're going to be trustworthy, if you want to have people say the things like Tychicus said about him, if you want that in your life, I do. I want to be like Tychicus. After I've studied this and I read this, this is how you live as a Christian. Verses 9 through 21. Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor that is evil. Cling to that is good. Pick good, not evil. Love evenly with everybody. Don't be picking and choosing. Be kindly affectionate to one another, church. Brotherly love, with brotherly love. In honor, giving preference to one another, not lagging in diligence. Don't lag in diligence toward one another between you. Know how to treat each other. Make sure you do that. In honor, giving preference to one another, not lagging in diligence. Fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation. When hard times come, be patient. It's for a time. It's a short time. Continuing steadfastly in prayers, distributing to the needs of the saints, giving in hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. When we're hurting, we hurt with each other. Rejoice when good things happen with each other. Be of the same mind toward one another. Love each other the same. Don't set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. Don't think you're always the one that knows the most. Consider the opinions of your brothers and sisters. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, and I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him drink, for in doing so you will heap coals of fire on his head. And don't overcome evil by evil, but overcome evil with good. Tychicus was a hard worker that didn't back down, was always at the front, and I'm betting Tychicus knew. I bet Tychicus knew what I just read to you, and I bet he put it in his life. And that's what I'm going to say to you for practical application this morning. Mark these pages, because it's got a lot of life in them here in Romans chapter 12, verses 12 through 19. This week when you're challenged, this week when you're burdened, when you're having difficulty, or when you're happy, read these verses and see how that applies to your week, to what's happening to you that day. And I hope whenever life is challenging to you, like I bet it was for Tychicus, I bet it was for Onesimus, when he had to go back and had to face Philemon. You know, I never knew that Tychicus traveled with him, but that's what we learned from this story. I always thought Philemon went by himself, but he didn't. He had a Tychicus with him. Be a Tychicus in somebody's life. Go with them on a hard day. Help them when they have to face something that's extremely difficult.
I was going to mention, since you mentioned Onesimus, Paul tells him that was useful to me. He's going to be more useful to you now that he's a Christian than he was before.
Last comment, and then the class is yours. Whenever they said that Tychicus was faithful, nowadays when we say somebody's faithful, we probably mean what? They're usually at service every time the door's open. That's not to be looked down on. That's a great compliment if somebody can say that by your pattern or by what they know about you. But if you want to really be faithful, live right there in Romans, what you just read. That's what faithful really means. And then coming and worshiping will be a joy to you. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.